Welcome to the ELD summer session's last and final meeting. I'm very happy to welcome you to this online afternoon series. The series has taken us all around the world to learn more about land management and land use. Today I'm very happy to welcome Andreas Lange to this afternoon session. Andreas Lange is advisor with the GIZ, advisor on land management and land governance. Dr. Andreas Lange holds a doctoral degree from the Humboldt University in Berlin, and today he will introduce us into integrated ecosystem management in the Philippines. Welcome, Andreas Lange.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about integrated ecosystem management made simple. SIMPLE is an acronym that stands for Sustainable Integrated Management and Planning for Local Government Ecosystem. It's basically a training approach that we have developed in the Philippines, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit, give you an overview of what we did and why we did it, and I hope we have time for you to ask questions and maybe go into some details. I'm switching to share mode because I have some a little bit of an animation in the PowerPoint, so I hope you'll be able to see that. Just as a brief overview, land in the Philippines is a very complicated topic, and one of the core issues we have is that land classifications or land types are segregated in different, we call it domains. Private domain, it's basically private land. We have public land, which is the public domain. It's mostly forest lands, but also mineral lands, untitled land, national parks. That's around 53% of the Philippine land mass. And we also have an ancestral domain. These are basically areas where indigenous peoples live and that also follow a separate regulatory framework. And of course, what happens is there's a lot of conflicts because the settlement patterns and the regulatory and legal elements here are not 100% complementary, so we have conflict. And
Herr Lange, darf ich einmal kurz unterbrechen?
Yeah.
I think that you need to move forward the PowerPoint presentation. I only see the first slide.
Okay, then maybe I switch back to this one.
Yes.
Can you see this one now?
Yes.
Okay, then maybe the sharing mode didn't work.
Yeah, maybe transmission was not fast enough because.
Okay. Okay, I'm turning back on my camera. Okay, so basically, yeah, these are the, I hope you can see it now. Okay, so these are basically the three, what I just explained, the three domains, and you have conflicts in who can access land, how land is being used, what laws to apply, and you have sort of a fragmentation in the regulatory frameworks. And it's sort of the overall issue you're dealing with when you deal with land questions in the Philippines. And let me show you some pictures just to also show you the diversity of land in the Philippines. Here you can see the beautiful rice terraces. This is a landscape that was being developed by old indigenous people in the north of the Philippines, basically starting 2,000 years ago until today. It's a UNESCO heritage site, and it's quite impressive to see, very efficient, very well regulated, also from the ecological perspective, very well functioning. Second picture I wanted to show you, Metro Manila. So you see a highly urbanized setting with all the urban issues that you can probably think of in a country like the Philippines. Of course, we have poverty and settlement issues here. Photo of a dump site where basically trash collectors filter out what is left from the trash and use what still can be used. And these people actually live on that site in a pretty undecent environment. And yeah, we have issues here, siltation, that you also see. You can see the rivers are carrying a lot of soil into the coastal areas. It has negative effects on rivers, not only on the rivers but on the reefs, on fish catch, etc., caused by deforestation. And yeah, we have this one here. You have very strong susceptibility and vulnerability to natural catastrophes, natural disasters. You've probably all seen the pictures last year when Typhoon Haiyan, local name Yolanda, struck the Philippines. I took that photo in November last year, 10 days after. You basically see 100% destruction of settlements and of areas where people live. It's it's a very strong, probably one of the strongest typhoon ever to make landfall. You see this one here. A ship is brought on shore, almost probably 200 meters on land, has destroyed houses and settlements. So it's a very strong storm surge, it's a tsunami-like storm surge that caused those destructions. And yeah, of course, why is there a need for integrated ecosystem management? As you can see, as you can see also from the diversity of the issues that countries like the Philippines have to deal with. Of course, first of all, you have a legal regulatory issue, and in the Philippines we have a fragmented planning system. There's too many planning documents. They're not integrated, especially in the different domains I showed you earlier: private domain, public domain. Also in the indigenous people domain, there's different management instruments and tools that don't really match together. We see from second bullet, coastal forest areas are mostly excluded in planning. Very serious issue because the town planning or planning for settlements usually does not really look into impacts in ecosystem outside of the settlement, like forests or coastal areas. They're simply not integrated, and there's no framework, no management planning framework that helps decision makers at the local level to look into their natural environment. We have climate change and disaster issues, of course. You've seen the photos. Very serious issue for the Philippines. Philippines is, I think, number 2 or 3 in the world in terms of vulnerability, so that's something that needs to be taken in account in planning, of course. And we also have inadequate capacity, meaning people are not well trained. They're lacking technologies, and also here we need to do something. And we've basically tried to look into all those 4 aspects when we developed this approach. We started developing this in 2006, 2007 as part of a big GIZ implemented project, and the program name is called Environment and Rural Development Program. It's still running for 1 year, and the simple approach was one of its main outcomes. Basically, what we try to do is, if you look at this graph here, if you look at what we call the ridge to reef, so from the forest line all the way down to the coastline, we try to look into ecosystems and urban systems in connection, and developed this intervention, or this planning and management approach that helps local government, especially local government decision makers and planners, to look into all these things in a comprehensive way. And there are some existing legal and regulatory elements in the Philippines that we have used. There is a comprehensive development plan that's an existing planning document, which we have expanded in coverage. So it's reaching from the 15-kilometer coastal area all the way into lowlands, uplands, and forest. And it's also looking, it's a multi-level approach, so it has a national component and a regional and a local component. So it's an integrated approach, and we basically differentiate here between planning elements and management elements. And I'll be showing you some more slides to illustrate this. So basically, yeah, simple. It's an integrated ecosystem management approach. It's meant for local governments, and it's supposed to help local governments to manage land in a combined perspective. What I've shown you on the second slide with the different domains. So this approach, we're trying to bring all these things together because the differentiation between public lands, private lands, ancestral domains is usually artificial because they usually find those differences within the territory of a local government. So the political borders usually cross into different land categories. So there's really a need for a local government to manage this in a combined way. And yeah, of course, there is a lot of details behind this. I'm not sure if we will have time to go through this. Maybe just quickly, it's basically 5 phases. I'm not sure if you can see all. Maybe I have to make this a little bit smaller for you. If you can see all elements here, we have 5 phases. The first phase is basically a training phase where we establish trainer pools and where we link regional, provincial, municipal, village planning into a training program. And there is also detailed training on geographic information systems, on specialty topics like climate change. We have provided trainings also for topics like gender, conflicts. I mentioned already GIS. We have other specialty topics like coastal zone management, forest land management, etc. And so as it proceeds, it's basically a training component, and then there's a component 3 and 4 where you look into budgeting. It's a very crucial step because those planning documents don't get implemented if they don't have budgets and budget items for certain priorities they want to implement. So budgeting is very crucial, linking plans with budgets. And the management implementation side, I will show you some examples later on how this is being done. In the Philippines, usually everything that's in relation to land enforcement or compliance of land use follows the zoning system, which is basically a US system or an Anglo-American system where different land uses are basically assigned to certain zones. I'll show you some maps later on how this works. And local governments usually establish zoning offices where they check for compliance if, for example, people apply for certain, for example, if they apply for building permits or for certain land uses, agricultural land uses, etc. So the zoning office will actually check whether this zone allows for this kind of use. Simple, basically, as I mentioned earlier, it's a more comprehensive training program. You see here an example of how we build this up. You see the colored elements, the colored boxes on the right are the different training modules that are available. That are usually sessions. They're built in a session way that can be used by trainers. It can also be used for self-learning. And at the moment, we're looking at 11 of those modules that we built and adjusted to the Philippine context. And this one shows you a map of a central part of the Philippines. If you look on the left side here, you have the map of the Philippines and a little red box, and this part is called the Visayas. That is the central. It's the central Philippines. It's a group of several islands, and you see the colored the colored elements in that map, these are municipalities that have used the approach we have developed together with them. And basically everything you see in red, orange, and green are those that have already progressed into actual plan approval. The purple ones are at the moment still developing it. They've been trained, and they are still working on their actually planning, on their actual planning process. Okay, now I'd like to give you some examples and try to explain to you how we built this up also at the national level. Of course, in planning, especially land use planning, you need to be scalable. You have to develop something that can be used on a large scale and preferably nationwide. And we have started a very good cooperation with a Philippine agency that is called Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board. That is a national agency that is basically responsible for the regulation and the framework of land use planning. It doesn't conduct planning, but it oversees the regulatory part. And that agency also issues guidelines and guidebooks how to do land use planning. And we have worked with that agency now for several years, and we have assisted them in adjusting their guidebooks. There's 3 guidebooks that describe different elements and different steps in planning. The planning process, that's volume 1. Volume 2 is about sector studies. That contains tools, for example, for climate change adaptation, tools how to integrate gender and conflict sensitive approaches, how to go about certain specialty topics like infrastructure, etc., in a rural setting, also in an urban setting. And volume 3 is basically the guide to here it's data management. There's actually a second volume that will then also deal with the zoning ordinance. So how local governments can implement such zoning ordinances and how they can prescribe certain uses so that their entire approach follows a more integrated perspective compared to what they have done in the past. And well, that approach was quite successful because those 3 guidebooks have really changed the way the Philippine planning environment looks like, simply because it is now a more integrated approach where not only town planning or urban planning is being described, but where you have what I showed you earlier, the ridge to reef perspective. So from reflecting the interconnectedness of ecosystems from forest, lowlands, urban core, and then coastal areas. So that is now reflected in those guidebooks, and we're now working. The colleagues in the Philippines are working with that agency to develop a training program that will be rolled out nationwide and help municipalities and cities around the nation to follow those guidelines. And let me show you some examples when we talk about zoning and ridge to reef, how this could look like. This is a small municipality, rural municipality here in southern Negros, one of the islands in the Philippines. If you look at the small box here on the left side, that is basically their urban core. You see the yellow and red dots. That's the urban core. So that part would have been only reflected in the old land use plan, which is really a very small cut out of the whole land and water area that the municipality is administering. Now with the new integrated zoning ordinance, they're looking at the entire territory. You might say this is not a big deal, or this is something that sounds logical, but unfortunately in the Philippines this hasn't been followed so far. Now a lot of municipalities are following it, and the advantage of such a perspective is, of course, that you can really work on the interconnectedness, especially in areas that have a lot of natural resources. And in this municipality, for example, you have basically 60 to 70% forest cover, You have also indigenous people living in uplands. You have a very large and important municipal water area. This is the 15-kilometer zone here, the light blue. And basically the approach here is to look into the interconnectedness and also draw some conclusions how to manage those items. How to, for example, how to identify critical areas in forest lands that need to be protected, how to protect them, what are the tools and instruments, etc. Yeah, CCA-DRR, climate change adaptation disaster risk management, of course, as a concern to many countries, risk proving, hazard mapping, risk mapping, and now recently in the Philippines also the question on no-build zones or no-dwelling zones, especially for low-lying areas that are susceptible to tsunami or storm surge, etc. So there's a big debate in the Philippines how to deal with that, especially since a lot of settlements are in areas that are only 1 or 2 or 3 meters of elevation, and the new guidelines are trying to give a direction to local governments how to deal with that problem and how to assign risks and probabilities to areas that could, for example, be susceptible to a storm surge or even a tsunami. Another example, municipal waters. In the Philippines, the municipalities are responsible for 15 kilometers, for a 15-kilometer stretch of their coast. So it's not a national responsibility. It's a communal or municipal responsibility, which of course makes it necessary also to assign zones, to have navigational zones, to have production zones that are used for example, mariculture, and of course we have fish sanctuaries, protection areas, mangroves, etc. Those things need to be put in planning documents, and they need to be linked to ordinances later on to ensure that it's complied with, and also, if necessary, to do law enforcement in those areas. So that's something that is also now possible using the technologies that are described in the new guidebooks. Biodiversity is a big concern in the Philippines. Of course, it's one of the biodiversity hotspots in the world, not only terrestrial but also in marine areas. And of course, you have a lot of issues. For example, here this map shows you critical habitats and how they overlap with, for example, mining tenements. So there's a lot of course, high value areas for rare earth in the middle of biodiversity hotspots that are, in addition, areas where indigenous people are living. So you have a lot of competing uses for those areas, and one of the crucial elements we have tried to implement here is, first of all, a proper data management, proper analysis, mapping, and of course then those local governments have to sit down with the responsible national agencies and work out a feasible management strategy for those areas. Another example here is forest land. Similar like biodiversity, you will have no-take areas or non-negotiable areas. You have areas that are maybe use areas. You have buffer zones, etc. All of these things have to be regulated, have to be integrated into the ordinance of the local government, so that the local government has a chance to actually manage and steer what happens in those areas. At the moment, basically, these are open access areas. Yeah, we have a situation where in the entire Philippines, around 25 million people settle in those areas in the upland. That's around 1/4 of the population of the Philippines, and these are open access, non-regulated areas. And one of the entry points, of course, here is now mapping and then looking into management strategies for those areas to prevent and prevent deforestation, preserve remaining forests, and maybe for the future also reforest areas and introduce sustainable forest management. Yeah, and maybe to close, I'd like to show you two pictures we have here. A picture that shows you one of those no-build zone areas that I mentioned earlier, 40-meter easement from the seashore. That's what they printed on their signboard. That is also Intergloban City, the city that was heavily devastated by the storm last year. And the government, the local government and national government, is basically now trying to implement what they call no-build areas, although it doesn't really, from the technical perspective, it doesn't make sense to have a no-build area because there's no technical specification where it is safe and where it is not safe. If it's 40 meters no-build area, doesn't mean if there's a tsunami with 5-meter wave height or storm surge with 3-meter wave height, you're safe in 41 or 42 or 45 meters. Of course, you have to build probabilities and you have to build risk assessments that show you under what kind of risk you are given a certain type of natural disaster. And that's something that we've tried to introduce over the past couple of years. At the moment, we're actually happy that the local government and also national government is taking on that responsibility. I think the problem is very clear to Philippine decision makers, but of course it takes now a lot of capacity building to actually train people to make those assessments and look into this kind of risks and hazards you have in certain areas, put it into maps, and then make decisions and how far you can actually play around with in the worst case resettlements, but of course there are a lot of other options how to help the population in the area. You can work with evacuation centers, with early warning systems. You can also work with a different kind of building structures. You can work with dams. You can also try to work with natural protection like mangrove covers, etc. So I think there's a lot of interesting work going on right now, and I hope that some of the technologies that we described will be applied here. Small example here for application of an ordinance. It's from one of the municipalities here in the south of Leyte, where a developer asked for a building permit in an area that the land use plan identified as a mangrove site and as a protected site under local legislation, and the municipality actually denied the request for building permit. It did not issue a locational clearance to protect the mangrove area in that part where that person wanted to build something. So there's actually some small successes and nice examples how those things come into practice. We have here also an example, something we assisted in one of the areas also in the Visayas, that is an eco park, a protected site that's been basically undermanaged, or let's say not well managed enough for the past 25 years. And we have now worked with the Environment Ministry and also with the local governments to introduce some of the elements I've showed you also earlier in terms of zoning, what can be done in what zone. So our approach has always been to say, if you introduce a protection zone, you also have to introduce production zones. You have to provide for livelihood. It cannot be always 100% protection. It's going to be very, very difficult to get agreement among fishermen and other people from the locality if it's 100% protection and a no-take zone. So you have to compromise, and you have to ensure that livelihood aspects are met, and that's what we tried here in the it's called Taklong Island National Marine Reserve. It's a small group of rock islands. It's a very beautiful area in the island of Guimaras. And yeah, maybe last example here also for storm surge, how you can work with probabilities. You can see, for example, here on the left side, municipality of Tanawan, that was also hit by the storm surge last year. You see the red part near the coast is their storm surge map, which they evacuated people. They evacuated people from that area. Unfortunately, the storm surge map was only calculating with a 1 meter wave height, and the wave of that tsunami, of that storm surge, was 5 to 6 meters. Some say up to 7 meters. So, of course, the evacuation area was not big enough to prevent casualties, and unfortunately, a lot of people died in that municipalities due to that extremely high storm surge. On the right side, you see also how you can work with probabilities. For example, how you can predict storm surge or wave height. For example, this is a 5 meter wave height, and you see the different colors. So if you if your storm surge or your tsunami is 5 meters and higher, the red part will be flooded, and if it's orange, it's sort of the next level, and then yellow and green, etc. So that's how you can predict. If you have a good prediction of your storm surge height, you can start evacuating people based on this kind of mapping. Of course, you cannot prevent damage to buildings and infrastructure, but at least you can save lives. And I think that's the end of my little presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Andreas Lange, for the fascinating presentation on zoning and land use management in the Philippines. Thank you very much.
Welcome, my pleasure.
See, people are clapping. So now it's question time. If you have questions, please put it into the chat box. So we'll take questions from the chat box, but meanwhile let me ask one. What would you say was the biggest success of your project?
Yeah, I think the biggest success was that we managed to work with the National Regulatory Agency. That is something that helps you to upscale your approach to the whole country. And that is something that we worked hard for, and of course we had a very good relationship also with the national partners. And in fact, we have many of the things you see were actually developed together with that national agency on the ground in some of the regions, and then later on with the help of those partners we were able to bring this to the national level, and also introduce some, not all, but some of the technical learnings and experiences into the national guidelines.
You were saying that scaling is, or like making the approach scalable is really important to be successful. What would you say is the recipe? What is a good recipe for scaling?
Oh, that's very difficult. GIZ wrote a long handbook about this. But what I can say from my personal experience is that you have to think big when you start. You have to think, first of all, what you approach, what can your local partner handle themselves. So you have to somehow adjust the, let's say, the complexity of your approach to a complexity that later on a local partner can also carry on. If you do something very complicated, something very expensive, there's a good chance that your local partner will not be able to do it on its own later on. That's one thing. At the same time, you have to think big in the sense that you have to develop something together with a partner that has the potential of spreading the concept nationwide. And I think there's a lot of good examples around. Also, other projects are very successful. I think the easier your approach is, the easier you also have it to scale it. Although I think our approach is not necessarily easy, although it's called simple. Actually, it's very complicated. That's what a lot of people say, but it's all a matter of how you reduce complexity and make it presentable, make it implementable on a larger scale. I think that's one of the main ingredients for your success. But I guess there's no blueprint.
Hmm. Did you face any challenges during the project?
Yeah, of course, you face a lot of challenges all the time. I think one of the difficulties is that land use planning or planning in general is something that doesn't have an immediate benefit. You don't see the immediate
Mm.
impact. It's something that is really medium term, and we try to introduce um, sort of quick wins during the process. For example, we put up a small fund, and for those local governments who underwent this planning process, we encourage them to do first village plans. So they would do small village plans, 4 to 5 year village plans with small budgets, and then we would provide a small fund that they could use to finance projects. And we would also help them submit their village plans to government agencies also to get funding, which worked really well. They actually attracted a lot of funding, and that made them realize that even if land use planning may take some time, take sometimes up 2 to 3 years per local government, but on the way there you have a lot of learnings and you can actually tap funds because you're already going into project development because you're collecting a lot of data and information. And
Hmm.
that challenge that local governments don't really see the benefit and the impact, that's something you can address by giving them sort of these perks, as I
Hmm.
call it sometimes.
Hmm.
And not really perks. I mean, these are just these are projects that are very useful
Hmm.
because it shows also the local community that implements or that basically is part of the planning and then later on implements the project, that something is actually moving.
Mm.
Yeah, if as long as no project is coming in and nothing is moving, uh, people also don't really participate. They don't care. Yeah. So you have to somehow think about how to bring something on the ground very quickly.
Did you was talking about participation. Did you bring in local people except outside from the authorities, apart from the authorities?
Now we have worked basically through provincial and municipal staff.
Mm-hmm.
So we have trained the provinces and the municipalities, and they would then do the village process. GSZ did not do it or the project, but it was done through the partner.
Okay. There is a
There's a
question
question,
from
yes.
Benjamin. Did you use financial modeling to advocate for integrated management to local elites, or did you focus mainly on the risk reduction?
Yeah, well, risk reduction was one of the incentives we used because that's really high on the agenda of elites and policymakers because it's something that exposes them to the community once a disaster happens. So people will always look to the mayor, to the village captain, or whoever, to the governor
Mm.
uh, in terms of preparation, but also emergency relief. So it's one of the strongest catch or some of the strongest hooks how you can actually get attention of decision makers. There are some minor others for livelihood, for example, but I think for risk reduction you have the quickest. It's one of the quickest wins you can get because it's not so difficult to make a tsunami map or a storm surge map or a flood map. You can do this in a few months, and you can actually implement also some systems, and that's actually what we did. It maybe brings me also to one of the points where you asked me for success factors. Our rural development program had also other components, for example, forestry, disaster risk management, coastal zone management, all these different components. They
Mm.
would also bring in investments and they would establish systems. For example, our disaster guys, they would establish local flood early warning systems. We established several in the area, and that's something that sort of fills your planning process with hardware and
Mm.
of course partly sponsored by GSZ, although the local governments and the municipalities and provinces it also invested a lot from their own resources. But this really brings in the integrated approach that we're propagating also sort of, from the GIZ side and from the Germany side. So I think that's something that's very useful.
Okay. Last question from my side. What do you think can other countries learn from the model in the Philippines?
Yeah, well, I think the Philippines have reached a very high level of expertise in some areas, some provinces, also at the national level, and the coping mechanism, some of the early warning systems that they use are already exported to other countries. For example, the flood early warning system the GIZ has developed is now also being introduced slowly in other countries in the region. Myanmar, for example, is interested. In terms of planning, I think the capacity of local governments is quite high, even though of course there's still room for improvement, but it's quite high. I think countries like Cambodia, for example, they're looking at the Philippines, very interested in the approaches, and I think the Philippines have also solved one issue, and that is titling. The Philippines have 50% of the landmass is titled, private titles, even though it's not at its optimum. It's not 100% functional. I mean, the cadastral system, etc. But it functions really well, I think, compared to many other countries in the region. Especially what I know, for example, Cambodia is struggling with that issue and is investing a lot in the cadastral system. So I think these are some of the learnings that can probably be taken. Of course, there are some things that you might not want to repeat in other countries as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas Lange, for this insight into the GIZ's land management.
Okay, I don't have your sound anymore. I can't hear you.
That is right.
Okay.
Thank you very much again for this insight into the GIZ's Philippine project in land management.
If you
I
want
guess.
More, allow me to. Can I type here? Can you read this?
Yes, sure.
If you're interested, just check out that website. We have uploaded a lot of documents, and if you want more background info, you can email me, and just feel free to get in touch.
Okay, great. We'll have the presentation on the YouTube channel, and if I may, I can upload the slides for all of you who may want to read more of the information in depth, and we can add Andreas Lange's email address so you can get in touch with him later, at a later point. So thanks to all of you for joining today, joining our final session of the summer series of the ELD MOOC. The ELD team is cooking up new exciting activities for this fall and for next year. So stay tuned, read the newsletter. We'll be out with more information soon. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all online in one of our next meetings. Okay. So before I close the meeting, we can do our fun part and switch on a webcam if you